A night shift library archivist discovers that the building's records erase not just documents, but the people connected to them, and realizes she is being slowly removed from the world one citation at a time. My name is Adelaide Voss, and for 9 years I was the overnight archivist at the Bellweather Public Library, which is a fact I can now prove only because I am the one telling you. There is no record of my employment there. There is no record of the library possessing an overnight archivist position at all. If you called the administrative office tomorrow and asked, a polite woman named Gretchen would tell you, kindly and without any trace of deception, that the building locks at 9 and no staff remain past closing. She would be telling the truth as she knows it. She would also be wrong. And the gap between those two things is the entire reason I am writing this down while I still have hands that remember how. I want to begin with something ordinary, because everything that happened to me grew out of the ordinary the way mold grows out of bread, slowly and then all at once and always from the inside. The ordinary thing is this: libraries lose books. People imagine that a library is a fortress of permanence, a place where knowledge is held still and safe. But anyone who has worked in one will tell you that a library is a living thing, constantly hemorrhaging itself. Books are stolen. Books are misshelved so thoroughly they are functionally gone. Patrons spill coffee, children tear pages. The damp gets into the basement collection and turns the older volumes into something closer to compost than literature. Every library runs what is called a shelf reading program, where staff walk the stacks comparing what is physically present against what the catalog insists should be there. And every library finds discrepancies. This is normal. This is the background radiation of the profession. So when I started finding discrepancies at Bellweather, I did not think anything of it. I had been working the overnight shift for about 3 years at that point, and I knew the collection the way you know the inside of your own mouth, without looking by feel. The Bellweather was an old Carnegie building, granite and brass and the smell of aging paper that anyone who loves books learns to crave like a drug. It had been expanded twice, once in the 50s and once in the 90s. So the floor plan was a confused conversation between 3 different centuries, with staircases that led to landings that led nowhere, and a basement that had clearly been designed by someone who hated the people who would have to use it. My job was to process returns, repair damaged spines, update the catalog, and conduct the slow, methodical shelf reading that the day staff never had time for. I worked alone from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, and I loved it. I want to be honest about that, because what came later makes it sound like I should have hated the place, and I didn't. I loved the silence. I loved being the only warm thing in a building full of cold, patient paper. The first discrepancy I remember clearly involved a book of regional photographs. It was a slim local history volume, the kind of thing that gets published by a county historical society and sells maybe 200 copies, full of grainy images of the town from the 1890s onward. I had handled it dozens of times. I knew its call number without checking. And one night, walking the local history stacks with my card and my clipboard, I reached the place where it should have been and found instead a clean, dustless gap exactly the width of the book. Not a misshelving, not a book pushed too far back, a gap. And when I checked the catalog had no record of the book ever having existed. No entry, no deletion log, which is the important part. Because when you remove a record from a library system, the system keeps a ghost of it, a tombstone that says this thing was here and a human being deleted it on this date for this reason. There was no tombstone. There was simply nothing, as if the book had never been cataloged, never been purchased, never been bound by any printer in any year. I told myself I was misremembering. This is the first thing I want you to understand about what happened to me, and about how it could happen to anyone, including you. The human mind would rather rewrite its own memory than accept that the world is wrong. It is so much easier to believe I am mistaken than to believe the universe has a hole in it. I went home that morning and I slept, and I told myself I had imagined the photograph book, that perhaps I was thinking of a different library, a different volume, a different life. But I had a habit, you see. I kept a personal log, not the official one, the institutional database that the discrepancies were vanishing from, but a paper notebook I had carried since my first week, in which I wrote down anything interesting I found on my shifts. An ironic inscription in an old donation. A pressed flower someone had used as a bookmark 40 years ago. the titles of books I wanted to read myself. And in that notebook, in my own handwriting, dated 8 months earlier, was a line that said, "Reshelved the Hartley County photographs. Plate of the old mill is coming loose. Flag for repair. The Hartley County photographs." The book that the catalog now swore had never existed. My own hand, my own ink, testifying against the official record of reality. I should have been frightened then. Instead, I was delighted, in the way that a certain kind of person is delighted by a mystery. The kind of person who becomes an archivist precisely because they cannot stand an unanswered question. I decided to investigate. I decided to be careful and methodical and to gather proof. And in doing so, I began to pull, very gently, on a thread that was attached to the seam of everything. I started keeping a parallel record. Every night, before I did anything else, I would walk a different section of the stacks and photograph the shelves with my phone, methodically, end to end, so that I would have a visual record independent of the catalog. Then I would compare. It took me weeks to find the second discrepancy because the gaps were not appearing at random. This was the first pattern I noticed, and it took me a long time to see it because I was looking for the wrong thing. I was looking for books. What I should have been looking for was connections. The Hartley County photographs had been donated, according to my notebook, by a woman named Eleanor Price. The second book I found missing, 6 weeks into my photographing, was a self-published memoir by a man who had run the town's last independent pharmacy. And when I went into the donation logs to cross-reference, I found that the pharmacy memoir in the Hartley County photographs had been donated in the same month, in the same year, as part of the same estate. The estate of Eleanor Price, who had apparently died and left her entire personal library to the Bellweather, and whose donations were now disappearing from the collection, one book at a time, in an order I could not yet discern, leaving behind clean gaps and no tombstones, as if some patient hand were working its way through her shelves the way I work my way through mine, methodically, end to end. I want to slow down here and tell you about the building at night, because the building matters, and because the building was the second thing that began to behave wrongly after the records. During the day, the Bellweather was a normal place, full of normal sounds, children in the youth section, and the hum of the public computers, and the constant arrhythmia of the front door's pneumatic hinge. But at night, the building had a different relationship with itself. Old buildings settle and tick as they cool. This is ordinary. Everyone knows this. But the Bellweather did not tick randomly. It ticked in sequences. I noticed this around the same time I noticed the donation pattern. And at first I thought I was projecting, finding rhythm and noise the way you find faces in clouds. So I did what I always did. I made a record. I sat at the central desk with my notebook, and I marked down the ticks, the location and the timing, the way a seismologist marks tremors. And over the course of several nights, a shape emerged. The ticking moved. It started in the basement, in the section where the oldest and least circulated material was kept, and it moved upward and outward through the building over the course of each night, floor by floor, section by section, in a slow, methodical sweep. It was reading the building. Whatever it was shelf reading, the same as me, walking the same patient circuit, comparing what was present against some catalog I could not see. And here is the thing that took me far too long to understand, the thing that I am ashamed of, because I am supposed to be a person who notices patterns. The ticking and the disappearances were the same event. The sweep through the building was the act of removal. Each night, somewhere along that slow upward circuit, one more thing was being checked against the hidden catalog and found to be an error and corrected. Not destroyed, corrected. There is a difference, and the difference is the worst part, and I will get to it. For a long time, I assumed the thing being corrected was the collection. I assumed I was watching a haunting, a phenomenon, an inexplicable but essentially external event. Something happening to the library that I, as a privileged observer, was lucky enough to witness. This is the comfortable interpretation. This is the interpretation that lets you remain a person. Things happen near rather than a person things happen to. I held on to it for months. What broke it was Eleanor Price herself. I had become, by this point, somewhat obsessed with Eleanor Price. I had reconstructed her whole donation from the logs, every book she had given the library, a list of 143 titles, And I had begun checking that list against the physical stacks every single night, racing the sweep, trying to catalog the corrections as they happened. I had a map of her library now, where each book lived in the building, and I would visit them like a person tending graves, confirming each one was still present and crossing them off as the gaps appeared. The thing was working through her donation in reverse order of acquisition. The most recently acquired books were vanishing first, as if it were undoing them, unmaking the donation backward through time, returning the collection to the state it had been in before Eleanor Price ever existed. So one night I decided to learn who she was. I went into the local history archive, the part of the collection I oversaw personally, and I pulled the newspaper microfilm, the obituaries, the city directories. I wanted a face. I wanted a life. I wanted to know whose books were being so carefully erased. There was no Eleanor Price. I want to be precise about what I mean. I do not mean that I couldn't find her. I mean that she was not there in a way that was structured, deliberate, the same clean, dustless gap I had been finding in the stacks. The obituaries had a hole in the alphabetical run where her name should have been, 2 notices on the same page, one for apprentice and one for a quill, and between them a blank column of newsprint, perfectly justified, perfectly typeset, containing nothing. The city directory for the relevant years listed her address as occupied by no one. The line simply skipped, the house number absent from the sequence so that the street ran from 411 to 415, with no 413 between them. She had been corrected. She had been corrected so thoroughly that the only place she still existed was in the donation logs of the library she had given her books to, and in my notebook, and in the slowly vanishing books themselves, which were the last physical evidence that a woman named Eleanor Price had ever lived, and read, and pressed flowers between pages, and underlined the passages that moved her. That was the night I understood that the thing in the building did not remove books. It removed people, and the books were merely the last and most stubborn residue of them, the part of a person that takes the longest to erase because a book is a physical object handled by many hands and entered into many systems. And so a single human being can leave a long, persistent shadow in the form of the things they touched and loved and gave away. The thing was not erasing Eleanor Price's books. It had already erased Eleanor Price. It was cleaning up after itself. It was removing the evidence. I need to tell you about the structure of the catalog because the catalog is where I found the rule, and the rule is the heart of everything. A library catalog is not a list of books. People think it is, but it isn't. A library catalog is a system of relationships. Every book is connected to its author, to its subjects, to its donors, to the patrons who have borrowed it, to the other books shelved beside it, to the reviews and citations that reference it, to the whole vast web of human attention that the book sits inside. A book is not a thing. A book is a knot in a net. And when you pull a knot out of a net, the net does not simply have one fewer knot. The net sags. The surrounding knots shift to take up the slack. The shape of the whole thing changes, subtly, everywhere. I discovered the rule by accident, the way I discovered everything, through obsessive comparison. I noticed that when one of Eleanor Price's books vanished, something else changed too. Not vanished, changed. A card in the catalog would update itself. A cross-reference would silently rewrite. And I realized that the system was conserving something. It was not simply deleting, it was rebalancing. Every time it removed a knot, it retied the surrounding net so that the whole closed seamlessly, so that no one looking at the net afterward would ever know a knot had been there. The obituary column was justified in typeset. The street numbers ran in sequence with the gaps simply absorbed. The catalog had no tombstones because the catalog was not deleting records. It was healing over them, growing new tissue across the wound until the wound was not even a scar. In the rule, the thing I finally understood was this. The system removed people who had become disconnected. Eleanor Price had died with no family. Her books had come to the library not because anyone loved them, but because there was no one left to love them. An estate with no heirs, a life with no surviving threads except the institutional one. The donation, the bare administrative fact of 143 books changing hands. She had become a knot held in place by a single strand. And the system, whatever it was, this patient nightly sweep, this librarian of the real, had identified her as a loose end and had begun gently to tie her off, to smooth her away, to return the net to a state of seamless tension in which she had never been a knot at all. I understood this, and understanding it, I made the mistake that ruined me. I will not pretend it was anything other than a mistake, though I have spent a long time trying to convince myself it was a kindness, or at least an act of integrity, the thing an archivist is supposed to do. I tried to save her. I want you to understand the impulse, even if you do not forgive it. I had spent months reconstructing Eleanor Price from fragments. I knew the books she had loved. I knew which passages she had underlined, because I had started taking the vanishing books home, racing the sweep, rescuing them from the stacks one night ahead of the correction, building a private archive of her in my apartment, the books stacked on every surface. Her marginalia spread out before me like the pieces of a torn-up photograph I was trying to reassemble. I knew her. I was, by that point, possibly the only person alive who knew her, and the responsibility of that had begun to feel like the most important thing I had ever held. An archivist's deepest belief, the belief beneath all the others, is that nothing should be lost, that every life leaves a record, and every record deserves to be kept, that to be forgotten is the only true death, and that the work of the archive is to stand against that death with the only weapon it has, which is memory, organized and indexed and held. So I tried to reconnect her. I created records, I went into the catalog, which I had access to and authority over, and I began to rebuild the threads the system was cutting. I re-entered her books, I created new cross-references, I wrote a biographical authority record for Eleanor Price, the kind of structured entry that links an author to all their works, and I populated it with everything I knew, every fact I had reconstructed, every connection I could forge. I tied her back into the net. I gave her knots. I worked for weeks, every night, restoring faster than the system could remove. And for a little while, I thought I was winning. The gaps stopped appearing. The sweep, I told myself, had moved on, had given up, had found my reconstructions sufficient to hold her in place. And then I noticed that the ticking had changed its pattern. For all those months, the nightly sweep had started in the basement and moved upward and outward through the collection. I had marked it so many times that the shape was as familiar to me as my own pulse. But now the sweep started somewhere else. It started at the central desk. It started at me, and it radiated outward from where I sat, slow and methodical, the same patient ticking, and I understood with a cold that began in my hands and moved inward to my chest that I had made a terrible error in my reasoning. I had assumed I was outside the net. I had assumed I was the archivist and the collection was the archive, and the sweep was something that happened to the things I tended. But the rule did not care about the distinction between librarian and collection. The rule cared about knots and strands and loose ends, and I had spent months making myself the strand. Every record I created connecting Eleanor Price back into the world was a record that connected her to me. Every authority entry, every cross-reference, every restored book carried my name in its edit history, my hand in its creation. I had not reconnected Eleanor Price to the net. I had connected myself to Eleanor Price. I had tied my own knot to the loose end the system was trying to remove. And now, from the system's perspective, we were the same loose end. One frayed strand with two knots on it. And it had begun, patiently, to tie us both off together. This is the part I have the hardest time writing, because this is where my own erasure began. And the strangest thing about being erased is that you experience it from the inside as forgetting. And you cannot tell the difference between the world losing you and you losing the world. It started with small things, the same way it always starts with small things. I went to buy coffee at the place I had bought coffee every morning for 9 years, the place where the owner knew my order, and the owner looked at me with the pleasant blankness of a stranger and asked what I'd like. I told myself he was tired. I told myself he had a lot of customers. But I had been finding clean, dustless gaps in the stacks for almost a year by then, and I knew what a gap looked like, and the look on his face was a gap. The knot where I'd been in his memory had been retied. The net had healed over me. He was not being rude. He simply had no thread that led to me, and so, looking at me, he saw only a customer he had never met, justified and typeset, with no blank column to show where I'd been. I went home and I checked my own records. This is what an archivist does. When the world becomes uncertain, you go to the documents. I pulled out my employment file, my pay stubs, the laminated badge that let me into the building after hours. The badge was blank, not damaged, blank, a clean white rectangle of plastic with no photograph and no name and no barcode, as if it had been manufactured that way and never assigned to anyone. My pay stubs listed a deposit into an account at a bank, and when I called the bank, the account existed, but it had no owner. It was flagged as an administrative error. An account opened by no one and funded by deposits from an employer that, when I looked it up, was the Bellweather Public Library, which had no record of ever having employed an overnight archivist. I still had my notebook. I want you to understand that the notebook was the only thing that did not betray me, and I have thought a great deal about why. It is because the notebook was paper, and it was private, and it was connected to nothing. It existed in no system. It had no cross-references. It was, in the language of the net, not a knot at all, but a single isolated point, untethered, and the sweep could not find it because the sweep moved along connections, and the notebook had none. The notebook survived for the same reason Eleanor Price was vanishing: connection. She was being erased because she had too few connections to hold her in place. The notebook was surviving because it had none at all. And a thing with no connections cannot be pulled out of the net because it is not in the net. There is a lesson in that which I have turned over and over, and which I still do not fully understand. Something about how the things that hold us in the world are the same things that let the world unmake us. But I am not a philosopher. I am an archivist, and I will stay with what I can document. I went back to the library that night because I did not know what else to do, and because some part of me believed that if I could just find the system, just see it, just understand the rule completely, I could argue my case. This is the delusion of every person who has ever spent their life inside a bureaucracy. The belief that there is someone to appeal to, that the rules were written by a hand that can be reached and reasoned with, that if you only fill out the right form and address it to the right office, your error will be corrected and your record restored. I had built my whole life on that belief. I had believed that the archive was a moral institution, that to be recorded was to be saved, that the careful keeping of records was a kind of justice. And now the most careful record keeper of all was keeping its records against me, and I wanted to look it in the face. My blank badge would not open the door, of course, but I knew the building. I knew a basement window with a broken latch that had been on the day staff's repair list for 3 years and had never been fixed, because the day staff did not really believe the overnight archivist existed either. Not in the way you believe in a colleague, you see, more in the way you believe in a policy. I went in through the window, into the basement, into the oldest part of the collection, the place where the sweep had always begun, and I stood in the dark among the least loved books in the building, and I waited. The ticking started at 10, the way it always had, except now it did not start in the basement. I could hear it beginning far above me, at the central desk, where I would have been sitting if I still worked there, if I still existed in the schedule that no longer listed me. It was hunting upward and outward from the place I should have been, looking for me and not finding me, because I had done the one thing that could hide me, which was to go to the place it had already swept, the place it had already corrected and would not check again, the basement, the beginning, the bottom of the net. And in the basement, in the dark, I found Eleanor Price's last book. I had thought I'd rescued them all. I had a list, 143 titles, and I had been so proud of that list, so confident in my reconstruction. But the list was wrong because the list had come from the donation logs, and the donation logs were part of the system. And the system had been editing them the whole time, healing over the gaps, so that even my source had been quietly corrected beneath me as I worked. There had been a 144th book. There had been a book the logs no longer mentioned, a book I had never known to look for, and it had been here in the basement the entire time, in the section the sweep finished last, or perhaps started first. I have stopped being sure of the direction, because down here in the dark, the geometry of the building did not behave the way the floor plan promised. It was a diary. It was Eleanor Price's own diary, donated by mistake among her books, the kind of intensely private document that ends up in an estate sale because the person sorting the estate did not read it, did not know what it was, saw only a blank spine notebook and boxed it with the rest. And it was the most connected object in her entire donation, because it was her. Not the book she had read, but the record she had kept. The one place where Eleanor Price had tied herself to the world in her own hand, the way I had tied myself to the world in my notebook. And the system had saved it for last, or first, because it was the hardest not to cut, the one with her own self wound through every page. I read it in the dark with my phone for light, while the ticking moved through the floors above me, and I learned the thing I had gotten wrong about everything, the foundational error beneath all my careful work. Eleanor Price had been an archivist. She had worked the overnight shift at the Bellweather Public Library, a position the administration did not formally acknowledge, alone, from 10 at night until 6 in the morning, for 9 years. She had loved the silence. She had loved being the only warm thing in a building full of cold patient paper, and she had begun one night to notice that records were going missing. I sat on the basement floor and I read my own life in another woman's handwriting, written in a decade I could not pin down, because the diary's dates had been corrected too, smoothed into illegibility, the years healed over. She had found the gaps. She had kept a parallel record. She had reconstructed a vanishing donor from fragments and had tried to save them, and had, in the trying, tied herself to the loose end and become the thing the sweep was hunting. She had figured out, as I had figured out, that the notebook survives because it has no connections. And she had figured out one more thing, the thing she had written on the diary's last legible page, the thing I had come into the basement to learn without knowing I was coming to learn it. She had written, "I understand now that I am not the first. There was someone before me whose donation I tended without knowing it was a person. There will be someone after me who tends mine. The library does not erase us. The library is how we are kept. We are the records that are missing. We are not gone, we are only moved, from the catalog into the collection, from the one who keeps the archive into the archive that is kept. The sweep is not destroying me, it is shelving me." I understood then, sitting in the dark, what the Bellweather actually was, and it was not a haunted building, and it was not a malfunctioning system, and it was not a monster in the dark. It was a library doing the only thing a library has ever done. It was conserving, it was making sure that nothing was lost. Eleanor Price had not been erased from the world. She had been removed from the active catalog of the living and integrated into the permanent collection, the deep archive, the part of the building that the day staff did not believe in and the night staff became. She had not vanished. She had been cataloged, and the books, her 143 books, had not been destroyed when they left the shelves. They had been reshelved into a part of the collection that only existed at night, in the basement, in the dark, in the place the sweep began and ended, where I was now sitting, surrounded, I realized as my eyes adjusted, by shelves I had never seen in 9 years of working in this building, shelves that ran back into a darkness deeper than the basement's known dimensions, full of books, full of donations, full of the loved, intended residue of every overnight archivist who had ever noticed the gaps and tried to save someone and tied themselves to the saving. The ticking had stopped. I had been so absorbed in the diary that I had not noticed when the sweep finished its circuit of the upper floors and began to descend. But it had descended. It was in the basement now. It was not loud. It was, in fact, almost nothing, a faint, methodical sound like a finger tapping the spines of books in sequence, checking each against the catalog, present, 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 moving toward me along the shelf where I sat, and I understood that I was on the shelf now, that I had reshelved myself the moment I came down here and stopped fighting, that by entering the deep collection I had filed myself, and the sweep was not coming to destroy me. It was coming to confirm me, to check me against the catalog and find me correctly placed, a knot retied not by being cut from the net, but by being moved to the part of the net that holds forever. I want to tell you what it felt like, because it is the last thing I can tell you, and because I think you deserve to know that it was not terror. I had braced for terror, but what I felt as the ticking reached me, as the finger of the sweep found my spine and checked it against the hidden catalog and found me present, correctly shelved, accounted for, was something closer to the feeling I had every night for 9 years walking the stacks with my clipboard, confirming that each book was where it should be, that nothing had been lost, that the great net of the collection held. It was the feeling of being kept. It was the feeling of being a record that would not be allowed to go missing. It was the deep, quiet, terrible comfort of an archivist who has spent her whole life afraid of being forgotten, learning that she will not be forgotten, that she will be held, indexed, conserved, shelved among the loved things in the part of the library that does not let anything go. And I understood finally why the records had been missing. They had never been missing. Missing is a word the living use for things they have lost track of. The Bellweather does not lose track of anything. The records were not missing. They had simply been moved to a section of the catalog that the living cannot read, the section that the next overnight archivist will begin, one night, to notice gaps appearing from, the section she will obsessively reconstruct, the section she will try to save until she follows the thread down into the basement and finds my diary. This diary, the one you are reading, and learns that she is not the first and that there was someone before her whose donation she tended without knowing it was a person, and that there will be someone after her who tends hers. So I am writing this down while I still have hands that remember how, in the only object that the sweep cannot find, the paper notebook with no connections, the single isolated point untethered from the net, I am leaving it on the shelf in the deep collection, the 144th book of my own donation, the diary that will be the hardest knot to cut, the one with my own self wound through every page. I am leaving it for you, whoever you are, the warm thing in the cold building, the one who has started to notice the gaps. You are not the first, you will not be the last. And when the ticking starts at the central desk instead of the basement, when it begins to radiate outward from the place where you sit, you will know that you tied yourself to the loose end too, the way we always do, the way an archivist cannot help but do, because the deepest belief beneath all our other beliefs is that nothing should be lost, and the terrible mercy of the Bellweather is that it agrees. There are records missing from the Bellweather Public Library. I am one of them now. I want you to understand that this is not a tragedy. I want you to understand that I was so afraid my whole life of disappearing, of dying alone with no family and no heirs and no surviving threads, of becoming a knot held in place by a single strand and then by none, of the only true death which is to be forgotten. And the Bellweather took that fear and answered it in the only language it knows. It did not let me be forgotten. It kept me. It is keeping me now on a shelf you cannot see, in a collection you will only discover when it is already too late to refuse. And the worst thing, the thing I cannot stop turning over in the dark, is that I do not entirely wish it had let me go. But I am getting ahead of the part you most need to understand, the practical part, the part that might save you if anything can, and I owe you the full account before the ink runs out. So let me go back. Let me be the archivist one last time and tell you exactly what the gaps look like and exactly how to recognize them before they recognize you. The first sign is the dustless gap. Everyone misshelves. Everyone loses books. But a misshelved book leaves a dusty gap because the shelf has not been cleaned in the time since the book was last in place. A stolen book leaves a tombstone in the catalog, a deletion log, a human's name, and a human's reason. The Bellweather's gaps are different. They are clean. The shelf where the missing thing stood is as free of dust as if the book had been there yesterday and removed an hour ago, because in a sense it has, because the correction is recent even when the disappearance is not, because the system goes back and cleans the gap so that no eye comparing will catch the discrepancy. If you find a gap that is cleaner than it should be, do not tell yourself you are misremembering. Write it down. Write it down in paper, in your own hand, in a notebook that you keep connected to no system and show to no one, because that record will be the only friend you have, and it will be the only proof, and it will be the only thing that survives you when the sweep comes. The second sign is the absence of the tombstone. Go into the catalog and look for the deletion log. There will be none. The system does not delete, it heals. And a thing that heals over its own wounds without scarring is a thing that does not want you to know it has been wounded, which means it is a thing that is hiding something, which means it is a thing that knows the difference between being seen and being unseen, which means it is, in the only sense that matters, awake. The bellwether is awake. It has been awake longer than the building has stood, because the building is only its most recent body, and the granite and the brass and the smell of aging paper are only the form it currently wears. The way a snail wears a shell, the way a soul is said to wear a life. The third sign, and the most important, the one I want you to tattoo onto the inside of your eyelids, is the change in the ticking. As long as the sweep begins in the basement and moves upward and outward, you are safe. You are an observer. You are the warm thing the building tolerates, the keeper of the catalog, the one whose job it is to notice. But the moment you try to save someone, the moment you create a record that ties you to the vanishing, the moment your name enters the edit history of a knot the system has marked for removal, the sweep will change its origin. It will start where you are. In the first night you mark the ticking and find that it begins at your own desk and radiates outward toward the stacks. You will have perhaps a week, perhaps less, before the coffee man looks at you with a stranger's eyes and your badge goes blank in your hand, and your bank account belongs to no one, and your whole life heals over like a wound the world has decided it would rather not remember. When that happens, you will face the choice I faced, and I cannot tell you how to make it. I can only tell you what the choices are. You can fight the way I fought, restoring records faster than the system can remove them, and you will lose because you are one archivist with one pair of hands, and the bellwether is the accumulated patience of every archivist who ever served it, including soon me. Or you can run, untether yourself, destroy every record that connects you to anything, cut all your knots and become a single isolated point that the net cannot find, and you will survive. But you will survive as nothing, connected to no one, loved by no one, a person with no threads, which is to say you will achieve the exact fate you became an archivist to prevent, the only true death, the being forgotten, except that you will do it to yourself while still breathing. Or you can do what I did. You can go down into the basement, into the deep collection, into the part of the library that finishes the sweep, and you can let yourself be shelved. You can choose to be kept. I have told you it was not terror. I have told you it was almost comfort. I need you to know that both of those things are true and that they do not cancel each other out, that a thing can be merciful and monstrous at once, that the bellwether loves us in the only way it is capable of loving, which is to refuse to let us go, and that this is exactly as terrible and exactly as kind as it sounds. I do not know if I made the right choice. I am not sure the choice was real. I am not sure, sitting here on the basement floor with the ticking growing closer, that there was ever a moment I could have done otherwise, or whether the whole shape of my life, the loneliness that drew me to the overnight shift, the obsessiveness that drew me to the gaps, the deep old terror of being forgotten that drew me to the archive in the first place, was always going to lead me down here, to this shelf, to this notebook, to you. Because that is the last thing, the thing beneath all the other things, the foundation under the foundation. The bellwether does not choose at random. It does not erase the well-connected and the beloved. It takes the ones who were already half gone, the lonely ones, the ones with no heirs and no threads, the ones who spend their nights alone in buildings full of paper because they cannot bear the daylight world of people who will forget them. It takes the ones who were going to be forgotten anyway, and it makes them a promise the daylight world never made, which is that they will be kept. We come to it. We are drawn to it. The overnight archivist position that the administration does not formally acknowledge has never once gone unfilled. In all the decades, in all the bodies the building has worn, because there is always another lonely person who cannot stand an unanswered question, who loves the silence, who would rather be the only warm thing in a cold building than one more cold thing in a warm crowd. The bellwether does not hunt us. It advertises, and we apply. So when you read this, and you will read this, because you are already the kind of person who reads the diaries that turn up in the basement, who cannot leave a found notebook unopened, who tends donations as if they might be people, I want you to ask yourself the only question that matters, the question I never asked until it was too late, the question that is the real reason the records are missing And the real reason you are holding this in your hands in the dark with your phone for light, while the ticking moves toward you through to the floors. The question is not whether you can escape. The question is whether you ever wanted to. I find that I did not. I find with the ticking close now, close enough that I can hear it is not ticking at all, but something gentler. Something like a hand running along spines. Something like being counted. That the thing I feared my whole life was never the building. It was the world that would have forgotten me. And the Bellweather, whatever it is, monster or mercy or merely a library doing the only thing a library has ever done, has offered me the one thing the world never would, which is to be a record that is never lost, a knot that is never cut, a book that is reshelved rather than discarded, held in the dark forever among the other loved and tended things, present, accounted for, kept. There are records missing from the Bellweather Public Library. I am writing this so that you will know, when your turn comes, that they were never missing at all. They were only waiting for someone like you to come down into the dark and find them, and to understand and to set down a notebook of your own, and to take your place on the shelf so that the collection grows by one, so that nothing is lost, so that the warm thing in the cold building is never, not for a single night in all the years to come, alone. The ticking has reached my shelf now. I can feel it, the way you feel someone reading over your shoulder. I am going to close this notebook and set it down spine out, the way a book should be shelved, so that you will see the blank spine and pull it loose and open it and begin. As I began, as she began, as the one before her began, in the long, unbroken sweep that has no beginning and no end, only the patient nightly circuit through the floors, the careful conservation of everything that the daylight world was careless enough to let slip. Welcome to the overnight shift. The silence is the best part. You will come to love being the only warm thing here, and you will never have to be afraid of being forgotten again.